History paper 1, November 2024 question paper from the Northwest Provincial Government, Northwest Province. So, of course, we're going to start on the instructions and information according to our question paper. So, you see that the question paper has got a section A, which is the source-based questions from question 1 to 3. And then we have got essay questions, which is 4, 5, and 6. Then on section A, consist of three source-based questions. Source material that is required to answer these questions will be found in the addendum. Section B consists of three essay questions. So you answer three questions as follows. At least one must be source-based question, and at least one must be an essay question. So the third question may be either a source-based question or an essay question. So basically, this is the scenario that we have in terms of our question. So moving on to the first part of our question paper, that is on section A, source-based questions. So on question 1, what were the consequences of war communism on Russia? Of course, the question 1 is on source 1A, source 1B, source 1C, and source 1D. So in terms of reference to source 1A, these are the questions that we have on 1.1. So we need to refer to source 1A before we start answering the question. Of course, in terms of source 1A, this is the information that we have. This source depicts the philosophy surrounding a Marxist-Leninism in Russia after the October 1917 revolution. So, of course, you need to go through everything in terms of the information that we are given before you attempt to answer the questions. So with that, I will refer back to the first question that we have on our question 1.1. Define the historical term communism in your own words. So where it is important is in your own words. So you would say that within that context, communism is a social, political, and economic ideology. So within that context, we have that description as stated in our answer section, as we are saying. Communism is a social, political, and economic ideology that aims to establish a stateless and classless society. Communism is a system in which different classes are abolished and the state controls aspects of life. So, of course, this is the description of communism that we have. Then moving on to the second question. So, in terms of our second question, explain in your own words what was the German philosopher Karl Marx's viewpoint on capitalism. So, of course, this is in your own words again. So, this explanation is coming from your own words. So, your own phrasing. So, in terms of that, now you can come up with an explanation that a system in which those who own wealth, e.g., financiers and industrialists, have political and economic power, and an economic and political system in which a country's trade and in industry are controlled by private owners for a profit. So, of course, these are the explanations that we have. So, moving on to the next question now, which is going to be 1.1.3. 1.1.3 lists two reasons why groups inside and outside Russia oppose Lenin's communist regime. So we refer back to the source that we have. So basically, in response to that, you'd see that the communists destroyed the democratically elected parliament. That's the first point that you can come with up with. And also they introduced a radical new social economic system as also an alternative, I suppose, that you can come up with. So within that context, you'd see that we have that point on this part where the reason for this was that they had destroyed the democratically elected parliament. That is our first point. And also on the second point, imposed one-part dictatorship also is another point that we can include. And also, they wanted to introduce a radical new socio-economic system as the third point that we can include on that. So we have those points as stated in our answer section, as we are seeing. So these are the points that we have. So moving on to the next question, which is 1.1.4. So 1.1.4, it reads, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why the communist revolution of 1917 took place in Russia. So why it took place in Russia is because the government of the Tsar was undemocratic or oppressive, as one of the points that you can also include on that one. So with that, we refer back to our other section to see the points as raised on 1.1.4. So, of course, we have got the first point is the government of the Tsar was corrupt. So, this is the first point that we have. The government of the Tsar was undemocratic or oppressive. The people wanted freedom or democracy. Economic hardship and suffering suffered by majority of the people. So these are the responses on 1.1.4. Of course, we move on to the next part, which is now 1.1.5. Explain why you think the new communist government introduced the economic policy war communism. So this is 1.1.5. So you would see that within that context, the first response that we can quickly pick from the source is that the took control of all private property. So to take control of all privately owned property. So that's the first one. Also to create a classless society and also to close the gap between the rich and the poor. So those are some of the points that we can include on that part. So if you refer back now, you see that these are the points that we have in terms of 1.1.5 to take control of private owned property and industry, to create a classless society, to close the gap between the rich and the poor. So and any other relevant answer also can be correct. So this is what we have on the first part of our question, that is 1.1. So we move on to 1.2. 1.2 is in reference to source 1b. So we refer to source 1b, so that this is our source 1b. This extract below describes the effects of war communism on the people of Russia after the 1970s revolution. So of course, we need to go through everything before we attempt to answer the question. So moving on to the first question that we have, it's select two pieces of evidence from the source that suggest that Lenin's new economic policy had a negative impact on the economy. So if we refer to the question that we have, you see that it reads, the policy had a profound impact on Russia, both economically and socially. War communism led to a severe decline in industrial production. So decline in industrial production and agriculture is the first point that we have. And also, you'll see that as we go on the next sentence, it reads that the requisitioning of grain led to widespread famine. That's our second point that we can also raise. So within that context, we see that these are the points that we have. 1.2.1, it led to decline in industrial and agricultural output. It led to widespread famine. So these are the points that we have. So moving on to 1.2.2. So on 1.2.2, it reads, name three effects of the civil war had on the mines in Russia. What were the effects that they had in the mine? So we refer back again to our source to check where exactly do we have the responses. So the years of the war, it left mines flooded. So it said that this is the point. These are the effects. Mines were flooding, machines smashed, factories and railways in ruins. So these are the points that we can try to raise within that context. So we have mines flooded, machines smashed, railways in ruins. So basically, these are the points that we have. So moving on to 1.2.3. How did the Lenin's government respond to the protests by the rural peasants against the economic policies? So how did they react? Uh, we go back to the source again to check where do we have the responses. So if we try to go down, checking where can we see the part where we have got the actual responses. So the source depicts that they were brutally suppressed. The revolts were brutally suppressed. Yeah, if you come on this point, which were brutally suppressed. So that becomes the correct response that we can raise. So within that context, we see that this is our response. The protests or revolts were violently or brutally suppressed by the Red Army. So that is our response on that part. So moving on to 1.2.4. Comment on why you would regard the information in the source useful when researching the effects of war communism in the people of Russia. So in response to that, the source is useful because it shows how war communism led to severe decline in industrial production and agriculture. It shows how peasants were brutally suppressed by the Red Army. It highlights how peasants revolted. It highlights the effects of civil war on the mines, leading to famine and epidemic diseases. So basically, these are the responses on 1.2.4. And of course, from there, we are moving on to the next part whereby we've got 1.3. 1.3 is on source 1C. So we need to go to source 1C first before we attempt to answer the question. So we're given source 1C. This source below is a photo showing a Russian peasant family during the 1921 famine. It depicts the widespread famine across Russia. So this is the picture that we have. Of course, on the first question that we have, it is explain why you think this photograph was taken of the 1921 famine. So in response to that, is to show the effects of war communism on the people of Russia, to show how famine and epidemic diseases affected the people of Russia, to highlight the failure of war communism. So those are the responses on that one. Then 1.3.2, um, why do you think this famine occurred in Russia? That was a major producer of food before the 1917 revolution. So, in response to that, the government or state confiscated private farms. War communism led to serious decline in production in agriculture. The requisition forced the seizure of the peasants' grain by the Red Army. So, basically, these are the points that we are responding with. So, moving on to and the next part now is also going to be our 1.4. Of course, 1.4, you have to compare source 1B and 1C. Explain how the information in source 1B supports the evidence in 1C regarding the effects of war communism on the people of Russia in the 1920s. So, in response to that, uh, Source 1B explains how war communism negatively affected people of Russia, and Source 1C demonstrates that too. Source 1B highlights the effects of famine and epidemic diseases, and this is shown in Source 1C. So this is basically what we have on the part. Then moving on to 1.5, we'll now go to Source 1D. So 1.5 would refer to Source 1D. Of course, we've got a Source 1D on this part. The following extract focuses on the results of war communism in Russia in the early 1920s following the Bolshevik seizure of power. So, information we have that we need to go through before you attempt to answer the question. First question, why, according to the source, did the peasants call for the overthrow of the communist government? So we refer to the source and try to see why the reason that we have that situation. You see that is issue of inflation being out of control. It's the issue of inflation being out of control. So of course, we can try to highlight, and also the economy, with the economy in ruins, which means the economy was in ruins, which is also another reason, and also inflation out of control. So we can just pick those points and include them, whereby we are saying economy was in ruins and inflation was out of control. The country was in the grip of famine. So these are the points that we can raise within the context of 1.5.1. That 1.5.2, why do you think Lenin meant by we are barely hanging on? So we go back to check where we have such a statement whereby we are here, we are barely hanging on. So it's saying Lenin was so concerned that he said we are barely hanging on. So it means it's a matter of a sort of giving up, whereby indicating that it was not successful. So he meant that war communism was not successful. He was actually acknowledging failure. So that's basically the interpretation in terms of those words. So we refer back to our other section where we're saying he meant that war communism was not successful. He was acknowledging the failure of the war communism. The government was in danger and the government was on the verge of being overthrown. So these are some of the points that we can come up with. So 1.5.3, why did the sailors at Kronstadt stage in a meeting in 1921? So obviously we have to refer back again to our source. Basically, the reason is that they wanted a political and economic freedom as indicated source, whereby they say the sailors at Kronstadt mutinied, revolted, demanding more political and economic freedom. So basically, that is the point that we have on that part, whereby we are referring to political and economic freedom, as we have on that part. Then 1.5.4. Explain why you think the Bolsheviks decided to change their economic policy. Why they decided to change their economic policy. Obviously, this is an interpretation of evidence that we have in the source. So you'd see that the government was in danger. It's because the government was in danger. Also, the government was on the verge of being overthrown. So those are some of the reasons that we can come up with, whereby we are saying even their most loyal supporters were revolting against them. The government was in danger. Government was on the verge of being overthrown. So those are some of the points that we can come up with. 1.6, using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines, 8 words, explaining what were the consequences of war communism on Russia. So in terms of the consequences, we have them also as listed. So this is our response in terms of various points that we have listed. And of course, this is the last part that we have in terms of our question one. Question two, that is, how did the Great Depression affect the lives of people in the United States between 1929 and 1933? So we have to start the sources 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D, and answer the questions that follow. Of course, we're going to start on source 2A. So but before we answer the questions, we have to refer to source 2A. So this is our source 2A, which we need to read through before we answer the questions. So the source reads, the source below explains the various economic factors that contributed to the Wall Street stock market crash in 1929, unleashing a global economic crisis. So we have to go through information that we have in the source before we answer the questions. So the first question that we have reads, what according to the source was the immediate impact of the Wall Street stock market crash of 1929? So we refer to the source again and see what was the immediate impact. So you see that at the beginning of our source, it reads that the 1929 stock market crash often comes first to people's minds when they think about the Great Depression. The crash almost instantly destroyed considerable wealth. So the impact is that it's destroyed considerable wealth. So this is the impact that we can uh, quickly deduce according to our source. So with that, we see that it's destroyed considerable wealth. So basically, here we are saying we are supposed to have destroyed considerable wealth as the impact. So we move on to the next question, which is now question 2.1.2, which reads, explain the term stock market crash in your own words. So you'd see that the description of stock market crash, an abrupt drop in stock prices, which trigger a prolonged signal economic trouble ahead. So that's the description of stock market crash. Also, we can describe it as a sudden dramatic decline of stock prices or a stock collapse, a steep collapse in the price of a stock. So, alternatively, we can describe it in that form. So, we move on to the next question. 2.1.3. Why do you think some historians have called the Depression an inevitable failure of capitalism? So why it is an unavoidable failure of capitalism is because of government policies, bank failures and panics, government manipulation of interest rates. So that's what we have on 2.1.3. 2.1.4. What is meant by the Great Depression was blamed on the economic excesses of the 1920s. So we refer back to see where we have got um, that statement of Great Depression was blamed on the economic excess of the 1920. So we go to our source and try to see where we have such a statement. So in that part, you see that if we come in this point, uh, it's from this point it is blame the depression on axis of the 1920s. So this is exactly what where we have the statement. So what it meant is excessive production of commodities as indicated, also excessive buildings, excessive financial speculation, or unnecessary screwed distribution of income. So these are the responses that we can give on that one. So we have the points also as stated in our answer section. As we are having. because of excessive production of commodities, because of excessive building, uh, because of excessive financial speculation, and due to excessively skewed distribution of income and wealth. So these are the responses that we have to that 2.1.4. So moving on to 2.1.5, where it says, comment on why you think the source would be useful to a historian researching about the causes of the Great Depression. So on that, you'd see that it outlines the reasons for the cause of the Great Depression. It shows the 1929 stock market crash and destroyed how it destroyed wealth. It highlights the failures of capitalism and other relevant answers also can also be marked correct. So this is what we have on question 2.1. Of course, we move on to the next part, which is now 2.2. So on 2.2, we have to read the source to be. So on source R2B, we refer to our source, of course, and this is our source. The source below is an extract from historian Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, 1942 to present. It focuses on the effects of the 1929 Great Depression on American industry. So we have to read everything that we have in the source before we attempt to answer the question. So question 2.2.1, identify two factors from the source and that showed that the economy was negatively affected after the crash. So we refer to the source to see how it was negatively affected. So it's that it reads after the crash, the economy was stunned, negatively affected, and barely moving. Over 5,000 banks are closed, so that's how it showed. So on that part is our first point, and then also huge numbers of businesses unable to get money is another point. Closed too, so other businesses closed, which is also a challenge. Those businesses that continued laid off employees. Employees were laid off, and also we have got the cut the wages of those who remained again and again. So these are some points that we can come up with according to our question. What, according to the source, was the immediate impact of the Wall Street stock market crash of 1929. So that was the immediate impact. So the points that we have represent the immediate impacts that are being highlighted. So these are the impacts. Over 5,000 banks were closed. Huge number of business closed. Employees were laid off. Wages of those who remained were cut and industrial production fell. So this is what we have on that part. Then move on to 2.2.2. On 2.2.2, select three pieces of evidence from the source confirming that many employees were laid off. So we refer back to the source and try to see where we have an indication that many employees were laid off. So if we come at this point, it reads by 1933, perhaps 15 million, which is 1/4 or 1/3 of labor force were out of work. So this is another reference that we can put. And also on this part, it's Ford Motor Company, which in spring of 1929 had employed 128 workers, was down to 37,000 by August 1931. So that's another point that we can also make a reference. We again try to see if we can find another point. We have got here almost half. By the end of 1930, almost half of the 280 um, textile textile mill workers in New England were out of work. So another point that we can also highlight. So those are the points that we have, and of course, moving on. to the highlights according to our answer section. We have these points is highlighted. And of course, we move on to the next question now, which is 2.2.3. Which reads, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain what former President Calvin Coolidge meant by this country is not in good condition. So we try to see where we have that statement. So we have it in this part, this country is not in a good condition. And it goes on to say, clearly those responsible for organized economy did know what had happened. So with that, we can quickly deduce why we have that statement. Not not in good condition. You would see that it meant that the United States economy was stunned or collapsing. That's the first point that we have. And also, he meant that the unemployment was high, and in other relevant answer can also be correct on that part. Then moving on to the next question. So on 2.2.4, quote any three pieces of evidence from this source suggesting that poor Americans were the ones mostly affected by the Great Depression. So poor Americans were the ones mostly affected. So we try to see. So we refer back to the source. We'll try to see where it says that they were the most affected. So if you come at this point, it says there were millions of tons of food around, but it was not profitable to transport it. That's another point to sell it. Warehouses were full of clothing, but people could not afford it. So this means this is another point that we can think that warehouses were full, but they could not afford it. And also there were lots of houses, but they stayed empty. So they stayed empty. That's another indication. And because people couldn't pay the rent. Uh, they had been evicted and now lived in shacks. So we have got an extension of that point. So these are the points that we can highlight within the context of our question 2.1.5, whereby it reads, comment on why you think the source uh, on 2.2, whereby it reads, quote any three pieces of evidence from the source suggesting that poor Americans were the mostly affected by the Great Depression. So this shows that they were the most affected because there were millions of tons of food around, but it was not profitable to transport it. Again, warehouses were full of clothing, but people could not afford it. So it means they were greatly affected. They could not afford it. So there were also lots of houses but they seemed empty because they couldn't afford the rent. That's another part. And they got evicted and now lived in shacks. So those are the points that we can highlight. Uh, so we have those points as stated. So on that part, we have our points as highlighted. So this is what we have on 2.2. So we now move on to the next question, which is now 2.3. So 2.3, we have to go to source or 2C, obviously. Before we attempt to answer the questions under 2.3, we need to go to source C. So this is our source 2C, which reads, the picture below was taken by Dorothea Lange in 1936. It shows the Great Depression migrant mother, Florence Thompson, age 32, the mother of 7 children. She was a pea picker in California. When this picture was taken, Florence had just sold her family's home for money to buy food. So we can just try to analyze the picture that we have. So question 2.3.1, why do you think this photographer took this particular photograph of Florence Thompson in 1936? So why do you think this photograph was taken? So obviously, uh, according to our response to that, you'd see that the photograph was taken to show the hardships and effects of the Great Depression. Effects of the Great Depression, or also devastating impact on families, also can also be a point that we can also include. So within that context, we check according to our responses. So these are our responses in terms of uh, the interpretation of the picture. So we go to the next question, which is now going to be 2.3.2. Explain the message the photo conveys regarding the lives of people in the United States during the Great Depression. So obviously, it shows that the Great Depression left Americans obviously in a bad state, and that's what it means. So according to that, now we say it shows how the Great Depression left the Americans impoverished. This is one of the points. It shows that the Americans were even struggling to buy food as a result of the Great Depression. Since we are seeing that in the picture, uh, a house was sold to buy food. So that's a clear indication. So we move on to the next one, 2.4. Compare sources 2B and C. Explain how the information in source 2B supports the evidence in source 2C regarding the effects of the Great Depression had on Americans. So with that, the interpretation will be in source 2B, the economy is stunned, and source 2C depicts a figure showing the women and children being affected by the poor economy. So basically, we are saying that 2C is reinforcing the message in 2B. So basically, that's what we have. So from that point, we have our first point. The second point, in source 2B, people had been evicted and lived in shacks. And in source 2C is showing a woman who had just sold her family's home for money to buy food. So homelessness is being depicted. So we have that also. So we move on to the next question now, which is now going to be 2.5. So 2.5 is according to source 1D. So obviously, we refer to source 2D, which we are having in this part. The extract highlights the reaction of the American government and business leaders to the impact of the economic crisis following the stock market crash. So we need to go through information that we have before answering the question. So the first question that we have for, we refer back to the questions that we have to see what the first question that we have for 2D. So the first question reads, explain President Hoover's reaction to the stock market crash and the subsequent economic crisis. So what was the reaction to stock market crash? So we refer to the source and try to see where do we have such a reaction. So if we read at the beginning of our source, it reads, despite assurance from President Herbert Hoover and other leaders that the crisis would run its course, matters continue to get worse over the next 3 years. By 1930, 40 million Americans looking for work could not find it. That number had risen to 6 million in 1931 in the face of this dire situation. Hoover's administration tried supporting failing banks and other institutions with government loans. So you see that the interference of the government in assisting banks is the reaction that we can also highlight. on this part, supporting failing banks and other institutions with government loans. So this is another point that we can come up with. Um, So we also have at this point whereby it reads Hoover, a Republican who had formerly served as a U.S. Secretary of Commerce, believed that the government should not directly intervene. So the issue of no avoiding intervention is also another reaction that we can also include. So within that context, we have those points whereby on the first part, we are saying non-intervention or interference by a government in the economy is an important characteristic of capitalism. So this is the first point. So also one objective motive of capitalism is business profit. Thus by providing government loans to banks and other big institutions, demonstrating Hoover's commitment to capitalism. So that's another interpretation in terms of the issue of assistance. Then we go to Hoover believed that the government did not have the responsibility to create jobs or provide relief for its citizens. That's another point which we can pick again from the source. Then moving on to the next question, I using the information in the source and your own knowledge explain how successful was President Hoover's response to the Great Depression. Of course, we are using your own knowledge. So within that context, uh, Hoover's reaction was not successful because the banks and businesses that received the government loans were not able to help the poor. So that can also be the comment that we can give. And also more businesses continues to close down, unemployment increased, informal settlements called Hooverville mushroomed in many cities. So these are the points that we have on that part. So moving on to the next question, which is now the last question. Using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines, about 8 words, explaining how did the Great Depression affect the lives of people in the United States between 1929 and 1933. So, so these are the points of how the Great Depression affected. So remember, our question is using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines explaining how did the Great Depression affect the lives of people in the United States between 1929 and 1933. So these are the points that we have. And with reference to the sources in brackets. So question 3, how did Hitler and the Nazi party consolidate? So we have to refer to source 3A, 3B, 3C, and 3D. So according to 3.1, we have to refer to source 3A. So within that context, we need to go to our source and go through our source before we attempt to answer the questions. So in terms of our source, the source below highlights how the Nazi Party used the atmosphere of panic to their advantage following the outcome of the 1933 election in Germany. So you need to go through the source before we attempt to answer the question. So on the first question, it reads, why, according to the source, did Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party call for new elections in 1933? So we need to refer to the source and see in terms of the reason that we have. So if you go to the beginning of the source, it reads on 31 January 1933, Hitler, conscious of his lack of a majority in the richest Reichstag, immediately called for new election to try and strengthen his position. So you see that it was to try and to strengthen his position as a point that we can include on question 3.1.1. They called a new elections to try and strengthen his position. Also, the Nazis aim to increase their share of the vote. So you see that this is another point to increase their share of the vote. So that's another point that we can also include. So we see that we have those points as mentioned in our other section, as we are saying on the first part, to try and consolidate power, to try and strengthen his position. The Nazis aimed to increase their share of the vote so that they would have a majority in the Reichstag. So these are the points that we have. We move on to 3.1.2. So 3.1.2, define the term coalition government in your own words. So we have the description of coalition government, which is a government by political parties that enter into a power sharing. So the government that is formed jointly by more than one political party is a coalition government. So these are the points that we are explaining a coalition government. Then 3.1.3, identify two pieces of evidence from the source indicating the emergence powers are given to the police. Identify two pieces of evidence from the source indicating the emergence powers are given to the police. So we refer to the source again and try to see where we have those emergence powers is highlighted. So by going through information that we have, so if you come here to check the police were given the emergence powers to search houses, confiscate property, and detain people. So these are the powers that we have. So basically, we are saying search houses, confiscate property, detain people. So those are the powers that we have. So these are the points that we have on question 3.1.3. So we go to 3.1.4, whereby it reads using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why the Nazi Party used the atmosphere of panic to their advantage. So obviously you can also uh, use your own knowledge, but of course where we have the atmosphere of panic, we can try to highlight where we have such atmosphere of panic. Of course, we have it is mentioned on this part. An atmosphere of panic and terror followed the event. This continues when a young Dutch communist, Van der Lab, was arrested for the crime. So the Nazi Party used the atmosphere for panic to their advantage, encouraging uh, anti-communism. So that's another point that we can try to point out, encouraging anti-communism. And also, we see that this is the most important point that we have according to that. Also, we see that this is the point that is also highlighted within the context of our answer section, whereby we are saying to encourage anti-communism, to reinforce Remember, the question is also requiring us to uh, bring up points according to our own opinion. So we have to encourage anti-communism as extracted from the source, and also to reinforce its position to intimidate its opponents as other points that are also correct that we can include. So with that, we move on to the next part, which is now 3.2. 3.2 is now on source 3b. We take note of that. So going to our source at 3b, this is also 3b, which we also need to go through before we attempt to answer the question. So question 3.2.1, why, according to the source, were minority groups excluded from the Aryan race? So we refer to uh, our source and see why they were excluded according to the source. So if we go through, at this point, one of Hitler's major goals was to establish a pure national community, a master race. The Nazi vision of a pure Aryan community excluded minority groups who were regarded as undesirable or racially impure. So that's where we have got our answer. They were regarded as undesirable and racially impure. So those are the points that we can include. So these are the responses that we have. They were referred to as undesirable. They were racially impure. So we move on to now 3.2.2. Why, according to the source, where the Jehovah Witnesses, homosexuals excluded from the Aryan community? So we go to where the Jehovah Witnesses and homosexuals were excluded from the Aryan community. So we see that at this point, we have the Jehovah Witnesses were arrested and prosecuted because of their religious beliefs. And many died of ill treatment in camps. And then in terms of homosexuals, were also incarcerated, imprisoned. They were incarcerated or imprisoned, and thousands died of starvation and brutality. So we see that these are the points that we have. So moving on to our answer section, you'd see that on the first point, Jehovah Witnesses were arrested and persecuted, tortured because of their religious beliefs, and men died of ill treatment camps. Homosexuals were also incarcerated, imprisoned, and thousands died of starvation and brutality. So these are the responses. So moving on 3.2.3, using the information in the source and your own knowledge. So what is important is also your own knowledge. Explain why you think black men and children of mixed marriages were sterilized. So we try to see if we have where we have points where they are explaining about that issue of sterilization. If you come at this point, you see that these black men and children of mixed marriages were forcibly sterilized to ensure the racial group would die out. So they wanted the racial group to die out. People with pure blood, those with blonde hair and blue eyes, were encouraged to have more children. So we can try to deduce from those explanations. So basically, the reason was to purify the race. Purification of the race, of course. Remember, the question is saying, explain why the Nazi Party used the atmosphere of panic to the. Oh, sorry, we are now on 3.2. So the question is, in your view, why were the young racially pure girls taken into uh, less benign project by the Nazis in Germany, which is 3.2.4. So on 3.2.3, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why you think black men and children of mixed marriages were sterilized. So why were they sterilized? They were sterilized because uh, this was to ensure the racial group would die out. So we see that on the next sentence again, they are saying people with pure blood were encouraged to have more children in 19, where they also encouraged to have more children. So that's what we have for that part. So in response to that 3.2.3, we see that this was to purify the German race, to establish a pure national community, a master's race, or to wipe out the impure racial groups. So these are the points that we have. Then 3.2.4, in your view, why were the young racially pure girls taken into the Lebensborn project by the Nazis in Germany? So this is in your own view. So in response to that, for them to create pure babies with the SS officers, to produce children of pure blood, for children to be indoctrinated with the ideas of Nazi. So, of course, these are the responses that we have. So, if you refer back again to the source, um, we have those points also as highlighted. If you come with this point, it reads, such girls could come to these centers to create a baby with one of the SS officers. The children would then be taken from their mothers and given to the SS, who took charge of their education and upbringing. So basically, this is enforcing the points that we've just highlighted. Then we move on to the next point now. So in terms of the next point question that we have, so 3.2.5, comment on why you think the source would be useful to a historian researching about Hitler's aim to establish a master race in Germany. So in response to that, it highlights the aims of Hitler to establish a master race in Germany. It explains how minority groups were excluded and regarded as undesirable and racially impure. It explains how black men and children of mixed marriages were forcibly sterilized. So these are the points that way. From there, we move on to 3.3. So 3.3 now is on source 3C. So we need to refer to source 3C, which we are having here. The cartoon below is depicting Jews, communists, and other enemies of the Nazis hanging on gallows in 1935. So we have the cartoon that we have. Of course, we've got hanging bodies that are being indicated in the source. So with that, we move on to the first question now that we have, which reads, what message are conveyed in the cartoon regarding the enemies of the Nazis? But we're seeing that there are hanging bodies, which means there are people that were executed. So from that point of view, we are saying it shows that the Jews and communists were the most hated in Germany. It shows how the so-called enemies of Nazis were hated in Germany, and also we can say it shows how those who were regarded as enemies of Nazis were executed. So what is being shown in the cartoon? So 3.3.2, identify two groups that were regarded as enemies of the Jews. So groups regarded as enemies of the Jews. So these are the groups that we have: gypsies, homosexuals, blacks. So that's what we have on that part. And then we move on to the next question. 3.3.3. Compare sources 3B and 3C. Explain how the information in source 3B supports the evidence in source 3C regarding the Nazi Party's creation of a mass unrest in Germany. So on the cartoon is reinforcing the message that is being highlighted in 3B. So basically that's what we have on 3.3.3. So we are saying both sources tell us about how Nazi Germany was founded with an obsession with racial purity. Both sources show how the Nazis wanted to purify the German race. Both sources show how the Jews were hated by the Nazis in Germany. Both sources show that not only the Jews were targeted or hated in Germany, both indicates that those who were regarded as enemies of the Nazis were killed. So that's what we have on 3.3.3. And of course, with that, I'll move on to the next part now, which is going to be our 3.4. So 3.4, we refer to source 3D. So of course, in terms of source 3D, we have our source 3D, which we also need to go through before we answer the question. So it reads this extract below highlights the reason why German people acted as they did against the Jews. It's written by a Jewish German, hence Magels. So we need to go through everything before we attempt to answer the questions on source 3D. First question, explain how the Jewish population was targeted by the Nazis. So refer to the source. We see that it reads, it was decorating the shop window with my boss, and I was decorating the shop window with my boss, and then we had breaking glass everywhere, all over. It just didn't stop. We looked out in the street and saw a mass of people, and we saw that at the neighboring shop, uh, all the Jewish shops had been broken into. So this is the point that we have, that the shops had been broken into. Remember our question. Our question is saying, explain how the Jewish population was targeted by the Nazis. So this is the point that we have on 3.4.1, whereby saying all Jewish shops were broken into. So we go to the next question. So on the next question, it reads, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why the Germans acted in this way towards the Jews. So they had to feed their families. That's the first point. They were made to believe that the Jews are terrible. They did it out of fear. It was a dictatorship. So these are the points that we gave. But of course, in terms of the next part, which is now 3.5, the last question. I use the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge. Write a paragraph of about 8 lines, which is 8 words, explaining how did Hitler and the Nazi Party consolidate power in Germany. So these are the points that we have. Moving on to section B, that is on the essay question. You have to answer at least one question, but not more than 2 questions. in this section. So, of course, we've got three questions that we have. On question 4, it's on communism in Russia, 1900 to 1940. Stalin's interpretation of Marxism, Leninism. So, Stalin policies on the Soviet people were effective and transformed the state into an industrial superpower. Do you agree with this statement? Use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. So, within that context, we have got the synopsis as given. We also have the main aspects now in terms of our response. Of course, we've got the introduction and requirements of the elaboration. Moving on to question 5, capitalism in USA, 1900 to 1940, Roosevelt's new idea. Explain to what extent the New Deal brought about relief from the economic hardships the American people were experiencing. Use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. So, of course, in response to that, we've got a synopsis is given, main aspects, and then also typical introduction. We go now to the elaboration. Also, inside the elaboration, we've got the relief of the unemployed and poverty-stricken, recover industry and agriculture, and reform social and economic conditions, and of course, at the conclusion. Mm. Question 6, ideas of race in the late 19th and 20th centuries, Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So, in terms of the requirements of the question, the Nazi Party targeted a wide range of racial, cultural, religious, and political groups in their desire to create a purebred master race in Germany. Critically discuss the statement using relevant evidence to support your line of argument. So, in response to that, we have got the synopsis, main aspects, uh, introduction. Now we have the elaboration. So, in terms of the groups targeted by the Nazis, other points we also have.